Hey there, listeners. This week's episode tackles some pretty sensitive topics like incest and abuse. Listener discretion is advised. And if you or someone you know is suffering with these issues, please call the National Sexual Assault Hotline at 1-800-656-4673 to get the support that you need.
We all need a little emotional support from time to time, but don't always have the resources or access to the support that understands us. I know it would have been life-changing if during the height of the online abuse against me, to have anyone else who understood what I was going through. That's why me and my team built the Games and Online Harassment Hotline. We provide free, confidential, emotional support for people who make and play games. Because we are people who make and play games too, and we get it. You can learn more by texting info to 23368 from anywhere in the US, or visit gameshotline.org. That's info to 23368 or gameshotline.org.
So it happens at every level, even in the level within this Black family, this sense of denial and the changing of memory in order to be able to live in the present and not acknowledge the trauma and the violence that's happening.
Welcome to Feminist Frequency Radio. This is the show that asks you to be critical of the media you love. I'm Anita Sarkeesian, and I'm joined today by a woman who only charges $1 for cryptic fortune telling. What's up, Ebony Adams?
What's up? I'm about to raise my prices just to let the people know.
This week, we are talking about Eve's Bayou. Here is a clip from the trailer.
How do you kill someone with voodoo?
I put his hair inside the wax coffin. Buried it in the graveyard.
That's ridiculous.
You want to face the dead?
But you can't kill people with voodoo.
Sometimes a soldier falls on his own sword.
This week, we are adding to our collection of conversations on iconic 90s Black cinema by delving into the aesthetics and atmosphere of Kasi Lemmons' directorial debut, Eve's Bayou. The film is a visual and verbal feast draped in the eerie kudzu of Southern Gothic conventions. The cast includes towering talents like Samuel L. Jackson, Lynn Whitfield, Diane Carroll, Debbie Morgan, and Bondi Curtis Call, but is especially notable for introducing the world to a young Journey Smollett as Eve. Set in a long-standing Creole community in the 1960s, Eve's Bayou follows the Batiste family over a fateful summer as uncanny, sinister, and ultimately all too human passions and darkness threaten the integrity and happiness of each member of the family. When young Eve witnesses the father she worships in a compromising position with the luscious Maddie Moreau during a family party, the inexorable events of the story grind into motion. But the true devastation occurs when Eve's 14-year-old sister Cicely reveals an atrocious secret that's been consuming her. Joining us to talk about this gem of a film is special returning guest and friend of mine who you last heard on the I Am Not Your Negro episode, Dr. Taiyon Coleman. What's up, Ty?
Hey, what's up, Ebony? Please call me Ty. So good to be with you again today. Thank you.
I will call you Ty, but everybody else has to call you Dr. Coleman. Like, they need to give you your flowers.
Okay.
Like, I put in the hours. I can call you Ty.
Can we just call you Doc? Is that where we're at?
Yeah, or just Ty or T-Bone. It's hard. Ebony and I did graduate school together. So,
Man, so I need to be calling you Dr. Ebony, too.
Yes.
I can't believe I've never done that.
That's because I don't insist upon it, because when people call me Dr. Adams, I think about my student loans and I don't need the reminder of that trauma. So
yes, I'm with you. So just on GP, Ty, and Ebony, we're good, right? Because I got that same trauma.
Thank you. And maybe we'll talk in the bonus about academia and how I have culturally, emotionally, and spiritually divorced myself from that space. So that's another reason.
I'd love to hear that conversation.
Yeah, let's talk about it. But okay, so Ty, I wanted you to be on this episode for a whole host of reasons. One, because you're one of the smartest people I know, but also because when you're talking about a film like this that is consumed with, presenting the Black imaginary, you're one of the people that I come to for those conversations, Black motherhood, Black spaces, but also because you yourself are involved in what's, really patronizingly called like non-Western spiritualities, right? Which is a huge part of this movie. So I was like, okay, I know Anita and I don't have the range. Let's get somebody who has the range on the podcast. So let's get into it. You've seen the movie before, right?
Yes, and this was the second time to see it. And I want to say thank you for giving me that unpleasant but good experience, because when the movie first came out in 1997, I can remember watching it with my then boyfriend and getting mad at the end of the movie and thinking, wow, she lied, right? Like, talk about denial, right? So out of this podcast, there are like going to be 5 podcasts that we need to do.
Right.
And then now watching it as a mother of 3 children, right? So many years removed, seeing so clearly the incest or violation or the boundaries. It was gut-wrenching. It was disturbing, and also having me to confront my own internalized misogyny, my gender position, my denial, but at the same time still beautiful. And I think it speaks to Kasi Lemmons' work and the strength of her work, right? So man, it was amazing. But yeah, I walked away impressed by the beauty and stunned. And you're right, when thinking about the imaginary, I don't see it as the imaginary, I see it as life, right? But of course it's the imaginary because it's so not a part of the dominant narratives, right? This kind of white Western centralized text, where in watching that movie, there's nothing imaginary to me. To me, that's real. And I'll say this, and then, I'll throw it back to you. Think about the context in which the movie is coming out, right? You have Soul Food that comes after, you have Love Jones, all these movies that are finally presenting Black people as human beings, as having experiences, not necessarily dominated by constructed Blackness, right? And only responding to white constructed identities, as opposed to getting at what does it mean to be a human being. And in some ways, Black people who are different struggle with the same things that people struggle with, right? Misogyny, patriarchy, violence, incest, and what are lies and what are the truths. So yeah, no, it was moving, but unfortunately all too real.
Yeah. I mean, I guess when I say like the Black imaginary, what a better way of framing it would have been the weight of Black memory, right? Because I started off the intro by saying this is part of a collection of conversations we're having about like iconic 90s Black cinema, right? So we talked about To Sleep with Anger. We talked about Daughters of the Dust. And these are films that, did not achieve like a lot of mainstream commercial success, but are really pillars within Black cinematic studies, as they should be. And in every case, what we're talking about here is memory and the weight of it and the burden of it and the burden of like lineage and how we carry that. And that's a through line throughout this film as well, right? So that this film, you don't know what has occurred. You are given perspectives. You are given people's thoughts. You were told stories about things. But even when we think we're seeing something and we can say, this is what has happened, the film suggests that it is only like truth is subjective. And I just think like it's amazing, like for someone's first movie, it's amazing how deftly, Kasi Lemmons manages to like weave this tapestry, right? Because it's so dreamlike.
Yes, it is so dreamlike, but also too, it speaks to the tradition, I would argue, of Black people in America, like telling the story, right? The story starts at the end. Right. The end is the beginning. So at the beginning of the story, right, it is recursive. It is not a linear narrative, right? That's some made up stuff, right? Right. Things don't happen in a straight line. And you're right. It's about the memory, but also whose story gets to be true. And depending on where you're standing, I think I'm paraphrasing a line in the movie that the narrator says, it depends on the light, what the truth will be. And that is a really complex, if you will allow, kind of like a syncopated rhythm of reality, juxtaposed to Western dominated reality that says that there only has to be one way. Right. Where this walks away where you are confused, you're complicated, you don't know who you like, who you hate, who you love, and you don't know what the truth is. And I would argue that you see the truth based upon maybe what your own experience is. So thinking about my experience, having people in my family who have been victims of incest, right, of sexual abuse, that's where I was standing. And I totally, this time, at my age with 3 children, 1 in college, being able to speak, of course that happened to her. Of course she didn't see it. Where back in 1997, I didn't see that. And that's where we are. And in some ways, in 2021, the fact that you have that narrative and you have those memories, and think about the most recent high profile trials that we're having, right? Epstein, what happened to him, his madam who actually helped him recruit and abuse those girls. We still don't believe victims. So for me, yes, it was disturbing, but I would say it's part of the tradition of Black culture and Black stories. I mean, you and I could go down the list, right? Octavia Butler. What are other novels that have this kind of recursive, syncopated rhythm where the end is the beginning of the story? Right. And so it's not necessarily about what happened, maybe it's about what we experience in telling the story.
Yeah, I want to definitely get into that, and like the Southern Gothic and about stories built on trauma and linking it back to other stories in this tradition, so we've got Toni Morrison, Toni K. Bambara doing these things. But before we go down that road, Anita, had you seen this movie before?
No, I hadn't. I feel like it's one of those movies that I had heard of, and I even mentioned when I was watching it to some other people, they're like, oh yeah, that sounds vaguely familiar. And so I feel like it's a part of the sort of mainstream consciousness that, was beyond just the Black community, but maybe didn't, like, I don't know how far it actually reached at the time, because it won a ton of awards and got a ton of acclaim. So I hadn't seen it. I didn't really know what it was about. Ebony, you suggested it. And it is incredible. Like, it's an incredible film. And one of the things, it was made for $3 million, first of all. So like, this is hella low budget, like extraordinarily. And Ty, when you were talking about the ability of Lemmons to tell, or Ebony, I don't remember who, but to tell this story in the range and the depth in which she did as a directorial debut. I think the other thing that's really impressive is how the pieces of it that in a bigger budget movie would have been a flashback, right? It would have been like a whole nother, week of shooting for a whole nother cast and crew and whatever. And so like, I was impressed at how well the memory stuff worked, despite it being super low budget, right? There's this incredible scene where Moselle is remembering how her first husband died. And like, it's just, you see you hear it for a while, and then you see a reflection of two people in a mirror, and then she walks into the reflection, and you're just like, damn, that was way more effective than like recreating this whole scene, right?
Well, she's scurrying, right? I mean, what she's doing is that it's a practice where you can look in the mirror and you can transcend. And so in a way, it is memory, but it's also present, right? There's this notion. I mean, I don't want to go to Jacqueline Derrida, right? Like, I don't want to do that in a podcast. But this notion of past, present, and future, that's just all BS. The past is always with the present, right? Like, and so when she's scurrying there, you could say that is a technique that light workers or seers use, but it's also an acknowledgement that the past never leaves you. And think about African Americans. We're sitting here in 2021.
22.
There are people who can't, 2022, sorry. And there are Black people who cannot vote legally in some states. We might as well still be in 1865.
Right.
So what does the past mean if the past is always present? And so in some ways, right, the use of scurrying or those spiritual practices or voodoo are used to kind of mask or justify, but maybe she's speaking to a reality of a certain group of people, because in some ways there are no white people in the movie whatsoever, except for the presence of Jean Baptiste, right? Who exists through the lineage, right? But even that at the beginning, she bared him 16 children, and it's kind of implied, was that 16 children by choice or 16 children by rape?
Right.
And so there's a way that they are always still in that place. Yes, they were gifted this land. Yes, it's in Louisiana. It's 1962. They should be free. But you and I know that the backdrop, 1962 in Louisiana for Black people, that was not a cakewalk. So in a way, yes, I like what you're saying about that. But in some ways, too, I think they're begging us to question the past is the present. The memory is now. We are always in that space. And I think that's what's so moving about the movie, that, yes, here you have Kasi Lemmons. And I want to just call it, I think it is about the feminine. I think it is about her being a woman, that she is able to do it and to have the courage that she's able to do that with her work. But I'm not surprised. I think I read that she was writing short stories before she did this film. So in some ways, you see, like you said, the Southern Gothic, you see almost a Southern writer, right? Faulkner does it too, right? This kind of a way of making you question. And I would argue that if you have trauma, if you never get over what the memory did to you, the memory never becomes the past. It always exists in the present. It's just whether or not we have the courage, right, to see. And it seems like in the movie, it is the seers, right? It is the light workers, those who have the imagination, who have the courage, to look and to see.
And I think like this film suggests that in some way there's no escaping the trauma of the past and the way that it has like bloodied the ground, right? There's no escaping that, but it also suggests that there is an allure to the stories people tell about that past. So let's go back to the beginning of the movie.
Can I bring up one other thing just to framing just really quick? We jumped all the way to like the crux of the meat of this movie, right? Is about this trauma and whatever. But there's something to me that I thought was so magical about this film because it for a big part of it feels like the day in the life. Right. Like the day of the life of this young girl and her, spending time with her dad and like hanging out with her aunt and doing all this stuff and like slowly watching that watching the magic deteriorate. But it's still just a day in the life in a lot of ways. And that is just a more memorable day than some other ones. Right. Does that make sense?
No, absolutely.
There's something just really interesting about how smooth and like normal this whole film was, right? Like that, again, like living with the trauma of the time period, living with the traumas in our families, learning family secrets coming out. That is kind of a day in the life for a lot of people, right? That growing up.
Absolutely. I mean, so the film, as I said, in the intro, like once sort of the engine of the film gets going and we become more alienated from certain characters and grow closer to other ones, things do become more dark. And there is, this sinister feeling to it. But for much of the film, we are surrounded by love and joy and the way that these children are and the way that this community is, right? So there's that amazing scene at the beginning of people dancing in the family home and people are decked out. And can we talk about how for $3 million, hair, makeup, and costuming in this film, let me tell you something. Those people were beautiful. The music, everything, just put together.
Black people are beautiful. I mean, if you allow me to be an essentialist for a moment, like that's black.
Oh no, listen, I'm telling you,
that's black people, right? Like your auntie was always on. Like my grandmother from Arkansas, she was always on.
It turned out right, exactly, right? Turned out.
Yeah. So it turned out.
So we have that definitely, and then sort of the creeping dread, as the depths of Lewis's infidelity, becomes apparent as we come to grips with what Cicely has said. But again, okay, so we start at the very beginning with this black and white and this voiceover and the story about Eve's Bayou and how it got its name. It got its name from the name of an enslaved woman who was instrumental in the saving of the life of General Jean-Baptiste.
Yeah,
and
she didn't kill him, she saved him, right? That's the romantic story.
Exactly. And to whom
I was supposed to laugh over that, right?
Because to whom is, this a happy story, right? It's not like the idea that she did this out of the goodness of her heart. It was like, okay. And then it says, so, in gratitude for saving his life, she was given this land, which was named after her. And in her gratitude, she bore him 16 children.
16 children.
And the film does not, say like, haha, you and I all know what's going on here.
Right.
But we're supposed to recognize how ludicrous it is. The idea that she had any choice in the matter.
Right.
And that this kind of coercion will breed anything but darkness is ludicrous. But the fact that the film starts that way and the idea that women, and Black women in particular, their bodies are used to prop up men and offer comfort,
Well, don't you think that's
goes throughout the story? Exactly. It's a thread that goes throughout the entire story.
Right. Because we are getting, the unreliable narrator. We have the viewpoint from the daughter from Eve, but the mom says, I thought he was a god or something. But she says, at the end of the day, I realized he was just a man, not a Black man, but a man. So I think you both are right. The sensuality of the love and the beauty and the attractiveness, and it's so seductive, and the boundaries of relationships and that love and sensualness are unnerving, like you're on your seat, right? Does the dad kiss her too much?
Right.
Does he do too much with dancing with this woman is not his wife? But then the reference to Romeo and Juliet. So to me, okay, that made sense. It's a way that I felt the director says, let me give you a tragedy, right? Like if this was the Shakespearean tragedy or the Sophocles tragedy, right? This notion of what hubris, that even as with all this external backdrop of constructed identities, of misogyny, of patriarchy, at the end of the day, it's a story of what, even in the face of love, Ebony, genuine, true love, the fault of man is still to err. There's still tragedy. And maybe that for us, and I'm getting excited here, this is why I'm a nerd, that even with love, there can still be that tragedy. One doesn't prevent the other. They go hand in hand. And maybe we can only take it if we put it in the imaginary, as opposed to it's too hard for us to deal with it as a reality. Because how could my husband do that to me when it's 1962 and I'm Black and I have this beautiful plantation home that has 4 bedrooms and he's a doctor?
Right.
How could, everything works right if not for that?
Right. And that the labor of men and women, the labor of people is not enough to secure happiness. So it does not matter that he and his wife offer like the paragon of domesticity, of respectable Black middle class life in this period, right? That's no guarantee of happiness, but also in the spiritual realm, there is no guarantee of happiness. So you have Moselle, the incomparable Debbie Morgan in this movie, right? Who calls herself like, she's cursed, she says, because every man that she has ever married has died. And the end of the film does not suggest that she's going to escape this curse. There's hope for it. No. But she says like, I can only ask the universe to give me this, or if it takes him from me, that I be allowed to go with him.
Well, she's lying though. I mean, think about her, and this is what's watching it now as opposed to 1997. Think of how selfish that is. She knows he's gonna die, but she's still gonna marry him, right? And then she says that, she say at the moment, like, my brother and I, we're alike, like we're not that much different. And also too, I thought I was also challenging my own notion, right? Because the dad is an easy foe, right? He's an easy negative character. But look at her. She still is normally going to go through with it. And in some ways she protected the brother, but I guess at the same time, it's not black and white, for lack of a better term. It's complicated. And you guys talked about love. I also felt that the relationship between the women was very intimate. The relationship between the mom and the sister-in-law was so loving, right? Was so tender. It was a way of intimacy that they had with each other that she couldn't have with her husband. But yeah, I kind of challenged her on that. Like, why would you marry him if you know that you're going to die? Are you any different than your brother? And the brother has an easy cross to pick out, but maybe some of us carry our crosses and some are much easier to see than others, right? I think it's complicated, or I could just be the judgmental viewer this time around. I
mean, she saw Vondie Curtis Hall with that long flowing hair.
Well, okay,
I'm gonna get me some of that, Black Indigenous love. I'm gonna be in this.
He was looking good, wasn't he?
Yeah,
cowboy boots.
And so Vondie Curtis Hall and Kasi Lemmons are married. They've been married since '95, and yeah, I'm sure she was like, "Listen, I want people to see how good you look."
Yeah, and I want you to do a portrait. I want a portrait just like that.
Okay,
so we can let it loose.
I have a question though. Does he have indigenous root? Like it felt like he was supposed to be like indigenous, like Native American indigenous, and that I wasn't. Does he? As an actor,
that's
like,
my assumption. I mean, I don't,
because it felt weird to me.
Well, I mean, there's the look, right? But then there's also his name. And I'm blanking on his first name, but his last name is Gray Raven. And we know that in this area, geographically, there are so many Black Indigenous people. So it was one of the things that I actually loved about this film, because, I think had it been perhaps a white director or primarily white cast, the version of, Indigenous folks that we would have gotten would have been like the sort of, stereotypical version of it. It would not have been a Black Indigenous person.
I think that's a great point you make. And to support Ebony, she courageously is talking about colorism.
Yes.
She's courageously showing the complexity of race and intermixing, right? The French, the Black, the Indigenous, all of that was happening at the time. So even among Black people, everybody looks a different color shade, hair texture.
The hair, right.
Yeah, and that was beautiful. And that was a beautiful subtext that wasn't explicit, but enough to notice it. And when she's called red, which I want to apologize for, sometimes that's a derogatory term, but my mother is from Southern Illinois and she was light skinned, and that's what Black people call light people, red. That's what they called her. Red
oh, I didn't know that. I was wondering where that was coming from. Oh, thank you for
they are acknowledging, but it's a pet name. It's loving, it's adoring, but it's also people understanding that they live in an age of colorism. But again, the love is there, right? So that juxtaposition of the love, but also of the conflict of these identities that we have outside this boundary of our love. And I think you're right, Ebony. My hat off to her. You don't often see that, and I think we still struggle with representations of race that are not monolithic, right? That are not essentialist, right? So
I like just listening to you all talk, and even that, especially the last point of like, there's so much tension in this movie in like the most subtlest way, like ways that I didn't even know until you called it out, that I think really gives it so much depth and like honesty in a way that you don't get from a lot of other you don't get from a lot of mainstream films. With regard to that tension, one of the things is how Eve is responded to when she tries to call out the things she's seeing in the world. She's young enough that she like knows it's wrong and knows that maybe she shouldn't talk about it, but then is easily prodded into talking about it, as I think makes sense for this age. And so her sister is like, let me tell you an alternative history to what you just saw. And like, they show it. They show the fake history to be like, they're integrating a different vision into her brain, right? That's conflicting. And then you see the response from his sister, from Moselle, being like, who'd you talk to? Who'd you tell? Did you tell anyone? And her being like, nope. Didn't tell anyone. Nobody didn't tell anyone. Right. And that like freezing up. And then her sister to be like, let me tell you about the time I did this shit. Right. Like, don't talk about your dad, but like that. It was so interesting to me. And watching Eve be tore up with this secret that she's not allowed to say to anyone, or is like low key being punished for having, right. For knowing this thing.
I loved Eve so much because she's the middle child and she is a punk instigator. And there's nothing I love more than an instigator. The normalcy that you were talking about, Anita, earlier, about the interactions between the kids, for instance, and how like Eve's 10-year-old brain processes things, how it processes anger and causes her to lash out, or boredom just felt so real. So, the times when like, she just goes to like bang on the door of the bathroom where her sister's taking a bath, and just out of nowhere is angry. And it's just like, what are you doing in there? Or like when she comes in and bothers her and then runs out of the house screaming, she's trying to kill me, as if she didn't instigate that entire interaction.
She's a survivor, right? Very clever. But Anita, I want to go back to your point. Unfortunately, it's an often true reality, although every situation is not the same, but the frame is very similar, right? Structures are consistent, and we live in structures that perpetuate and encourage the sexual assault and exploitation of children, particularly women, by men. And so I've talked, unfortunately, with many survivors of incest, and they are often told at an early age, you didn't see what you see. Don't tell anyone. So I felt that was very true, and unfortunately, things that happen, and you watch the innocent person be corrupted. And to me, that's the layered complexity of the story, that it's one thing to have Jean-Baptiste and Eve and wonder whether or not that was a choice situation. Then what do you say then when a Black father is doing that to his Black daughter? Where is whiteness there, right? It forces us to step back and to confront patriarchy, not to mention the history, and I know, Ebony, you can speak to this, of Black women who have always felt like they had to choose between their Blackness or their gender, and then look the other way when Black men were abusive or oppressive, because Black men are oppressed by white society. Do you see what I mean? And so then you have that one structural layer, then it's within the family, right? Even the Cicely is, doesn't want her daddy to leave them, right? Still wanting to hold on to that structure. And in that name, many women are exploited, and it's a structure that still exists and unfortunately still continues. So I felt that was very true. But like you said, Anita, I think with the imaginary, it allows us at least to try to safely, I think, as best as we can, enter into that very violent but beautiful world.
There's also a question here about when the sister is trying to cover up Cicely's trying to say, no, you didn't see that. Like, don't break up this family, basically. There's a question of whether she's also protecting herself. Like, has she been harmed previous to then, right? Like the time that we see and the story that we hear about is, you know, it feels like it's the first time it happened, and so whatever, but there might be a longer history there, and so she might be both protecting herself and protecting her father and protecting the family, and like that feels very real too, right?
Yeah. I've read some criticism where some critics argue that, yes, it was happening, but that Kasi, as the director, is using a light hand. So the fact that the daughter is going to visit the father during the day at the office, the fact that she's very resentful to her mother and saying things to her mother that the father would say to justify why he's having an affair. Some people say that foundation and behavior had already been laid, and that the fact that she's having her period is not necessarily a period. You also bleed when your hymen is broken. So there have been some critics who said exactly what you said. And think about it, though, again, layered. Don't tell anyone because you don't want to cause this problem. Think of what's happening today in public schools, not wanting to teach American history, right? Don't talk about the real history. Don't talk about the oppression, because then we're not all going to get along, right? Different picture, but same frame. I would argue that kind of behavior, or the denial of memory or the changing of memory, is systemic to what it means to be an American, and it is systemic to U.S. culture. Yeah. Because in order for the culture to accept the violence of the situation, you cannot afford to look at the truth. So it happens at every level, even in the level within this Black family, this sense of denial and the changing of memory in order to be able to live in the present and not acknowledge the trauma and the violence that's happening. I think that's a great point.
I can't get away from, what you're saying, Ty, that the feelings engendered by the necessity of obscuring the truth, or of making your own truth, exact such a horrific price, particularly for the young who are in a position where they are emotionally and physically dependent upon adults for their very existence, right? And so you love this person. I mean, his children worship him. Lewis's children, worship him. He is not just beloved in the community, but in that home, he is the definition, of a patriarch, right? And so how do you negotiate how you feel about someone that you love so deeply, who is also responsible for being casually cruel to your mother, whom you also love, of being perhaps, dismissive or blind to the needs of, your siblings, as, he favors you, but then has also committed this atrocious act upon you, And I was almost like angrier when we, at the end of the film, so spoiler alert, whatever, the film is 30 years old. Eve.
I am. You just don't
listen. So the film opens with Eve in voiceover saying, "I killed my father the summer that I was 10 years old." Now, in her 10-year-old mind, she is responsible via, the voodoo practices of Elzora, who is, a root worker and light worker in the film, for her father's death. There's an entirely worldly interpretation of her father's death, which is that she is responsible, but she is responsible because she told, Maddie Moreau's husband, "Oh, your husband."
Your
that
wife. Scene was the way that the whole scene played out, where she just like really subtly being like,
She's
and what does your wife do?
And I'm telling you,
she's a little evil kid.
A little punk kid is my favorite thing to see on screen. Like, it's straight up.
Or see her as the truth, right?
Yeah.
It is the truth that unravels everything.
Right.
And so going back to Ebony, what you're saying is that how do you reconcile those things of extreme love but deep betrayal? Maybe that's the problem. Maybe what Kasi is saying, we have to be able to sit in both.
Yes.
And if we can't sit and learn how to accept both, that is our hubris. And notice how all the action unravels how people react to the truth. Right. So the husband shoots him, right? She tells. The wife slaps the daughter, right? All the moments where truth comes out, right? Even the grandmother says young folks are not allowed to talk adult, right? That's the point where everything messes up. And I could argue is the same with incest or abuse. When people can't stand in that space between the truth and what's real and the conflict, that's when we as human beings fail. And I want to include myself in that, right? Because I'm standing safe as the critic, but I would argue myself, I'm subject to that. And maybe that's what it means to be human. Maybe that's what the story tells. And maybe that's what life is, right? The material, spiritual, because Anita, there's a way that she says, I killed my father when I was 10, but who's to say that she didn't? The material way that it unfolded was just the husband shooting his wife's lover. Who's to say that was any less magical than working roots, right? And I think that's we have to think about what power do we have? What is the magic? And then how do we use it? And we have to sit in that. And that's what the director makes us do. We have to sit in it. And that moment she comes back to her sister at the end of the movie, and spoiler alert, and you have the visual note, right? The representation. And she submerges it in the water into the swamp. You're left to wonder what will happen to the truth and what path will they, as young women, what will be their story as they continue?
Well, also,
will they do better?
And if I'm not mistaken, we're left to wonder what the truth is. Like, I read it as is a story about incest, but then there's this whole thing at the end where you read his version of it, and then Eve confronts Cecily, and Cecily kind of acts like she was lying a little bit. And so now we're questioning the whole thing. Well, I don't think we are.
Suggest that she's lying. She says, "I don't know," in the way that you're
young and traumatized,
right? So you're saying when,
what is the truth
holds, when they hold hands,
hold.
right? And Eve, gets the vision, right? We aren't given another replay of that scene. It's just a flash of memory and awareness, and we aren't given some objective truth.
Yeah,
but and to go back to the thing that really. That was almost more horrifying to me than the father, Louis, actually assaulting his daughter was his version of it was equally horrible, right? So in his mind, he did nothing wrong other than react poorly when his daughter came on to him. And I was like, we know that this is the story that abusers tell, right? So I immediately discount that. But
it's classic pedophile.
Exactly,
confession.
But in his mind, she came on to me because, and here's how I knew, right?
Right.
So I have been grooming her to treat me in a certain way and show me love physically. And so it is safe for me to, make her culpable if I react, poorly. But let's think about what it would mean that we are maybe uncomfortable, but we're kind of uncertain, from the beginning. Is the father and the daughter's relationship, is it a little bit too close? Is it intimate in an inappropriate way? Or are they just very close, right? If there's ever a question about whether there's something weird going on, let's sit and unpack that. How many times have you been out and seen, an older man and a younger woman and not known by the way that they interacted with each other? Is that his daughter or is that his partner?
Right. But you also have to be willing to say, and, I might get beat up for this, I think it calls into question the whole patriarchal system has been created. I mean, it's problematic from the beginning. Yeah. And I want to go back to victims. I would often say that victims don't know, especially if you're young, you think that that's right. You don't know.
That's how you've been trained and groomed to show love and receive love. Right.
Right. And so that sense of confusion, I almost felt even that moment when she hugged her, that she really knew. Right. And that grace that she was showing her was her loving her. But I would say, no, let's unpack this. I mean, and particularly if we're talking about the South, right? There's a wonderful book called Slavery and Social Death by Orlando Patterson. And he talks about the Southern agrarian culture that grew up around plantation society and race, and how most of the violence of racism and slavery, right? Racialized chattel slavery was covered by pomp and circumstance, by politeness. So tea parties, dressing nice, making sure your nails are polished. And in the movie, you see that, right? Mannerisms, greeting people. It's inappropriate. So it's not that what you did was inappropriate. It's inappropriate what? To say that you did it. So thinking about your question, think about how the relationship between a father and daughter in a very strict, conservative, patriarchal system, that love works to obscure really the possible violence of that relationship, right? Think about fathers who give their daughters virginity rings, right? I mean, so at what level do you want to talk about it, right? Because I think to the extreme of what incest and sexual assault to what we think is benign, but I would often argue equally as violent, particularly if you're setting up a woman or a young girl to be in that system. Because think of Cicely, but think of her mother. So the father is not just violating her, he's violating the mother, but the mother has been groomed by a patriarchal system that has a violent relationship. So think about it. If this politeness or mannerisms or boundaries of roles of relationships, right, and social relationships and familial relationships work to cover what a system of slavery, those same relationships work to cover familial relationships as well. And so, yes, this is disturbing. And I would argue this is where Kasi takes us. And if we're brave enough, right, this is the stuff that we have to talk about it. Because I would argue young women now, very bold feminists are pushing back against this. And maybe just as we have to work against sexual assault and the exploitation of women and children, I think we also have to be willing to interrogate what does it mean to be a daughter? What does it mean to be a father if all of those things have been defined by violent systems?
Right.
That's deep.
Yeah. I guess we're going to break right there to let that all simmer. I have a bunch of questions, and I think that there's like a whole spiritual element to this film that we didn't even get into that I think is really interesting. So let's talk about that in the bonus. But in the meantime, we'll be right back with some Freakouts. We all need a little emotional support from time to time, but don't always have the resources or access to the support that understands us. I know it would have been life-changing if during the height of the online abuse against me to have anyone else who understood what I was going through. That's why me and my team built the Games and Online Harassment Hotline. We provide free, confidential, emotional support for people who make and play games. Because we are people who make and play games too, and we get it. You can learn more by texting info to 23368 from anywhere in the US, or visit gameshotline.org. That's info to 23368 or gameshotline.org. Now it's time to talk about what's been thrilling us, moving us, upsetting us, or infuriating us this past week. I've got one. I watched The Lost Daughter, which is the directorial debut of Maggie Gyllenhaal. The film stars Olivia Coleman, Jessie Buckley, and Dakota Johnson. And y'all, it's fucking great. And I was planning on talking about it already, but at the very beginning of this episode, Ebony, you talked a lot about the burden of memory. And that is exactly what The Lost Daughter is about. Have either of you seen it?
No, but I'm about to do an event for Women in Film with Maggie G. And
Can I come?
People from the film. Of course.
Great. I think that Maggie Gyllenhaal is really interesting in general in terms of like the creative choices that she's made, the roles she's decided to play. They feel very intentional and they feel very like challenging in ways. So I'm not surprised that her first film is of this depth and of this like beauty. So it stars Olivia Coleman as an academic on vacation in Greece. And then Jessie Buckley plays her as a young mother. So it's going back and forth in time. And what's happening is that Olivia Coleman's character, I can't remember their names, Olivia Coleman's character we're like reliving these memories of her relationship to motherhood, to her relationship to her marriage, to her kids and all of that through the eyes of watching a mother struggle in front of her on this vacation. So there's a I don't want to say whimsical, but there's like a kind of an ethereal feeling to the film. And there's like a dreamlikeness because it's going back and forth in time. The performances are exquisite. I think the story, did Maggie Gyllenhaal write this movie too? I think she wrote it. And it's just, I highly recommend it. It's on Netflix. It's very good. Come at me. I want to hear more. I want to talk about this movie.
Netflix is really, pushing forward a lot of powerful female-directed films this award season, and I hope they will continue to do it outside of award season. But I mean, you've got like The Power of the Dog with Jane Campion, You've got Lost Daughter, Maggie Gyllenhaal. You've got Passing from Rebecca Hall, and there's so many more. Like there's a bunch of foreign films that I have not seen yet that I want to, that I know are being put forward for Best Foreign Film Oscars. But like more of this, please. More of this.
Yeah, for real. All right, if you want to submit your own freak out, you can do that at feministfrequency.com/freakout. Thank you all so much for listening to Feminist Frequency Radio. Ty, do you have anything you want to plug? Can people find you anywhere? Anything you want to...
Tell people how to get your books and stuff.
Yeah, you got books? Tell us about your books.
Well, I would just plug, I'm in an anthology called Spark, which is about George Floyd, the progressive illusion of Minnesota. I have an essay called What's Understood Doesn't Need to Be Explained, about this notion about why American success and exceptionalism continues to come at the cost of brown and black bodies and their lives. And then my book, Traveling Without Moving, is forthcoming from the University of Minnesota Press this year, and is a collection of critical essays looking at everything from police violence to motherhood, and what does it mean to be a Black woman trying to be in academia and institutions that historically were not meant for women and people of color.
And coming in 2023 is a new podcast from Ty that I will be co-producing. And it's basically going to be me pulling a different tarot card once a week and Ty walking me through the interpretation. So tune in for Black Magic coming in spring of 2023.
Thank you.
Hell yeah.
Thank you.
Oh my God. Next week, we are switching things up a little bit. We're talking about a novel. We've never done that before. I haven't read it yet, so I'm a little stressed. I don't even have the book yet. I'm a little stressed. We're going to talk about Song of Solomon by Toni Morrison. Hell yeah, we are. And
that's one of my favorite novels.
It is amazing, right?
It is, and it's a hard read, but it's worth it.
It's so good.
A pound of flesh.
I had to choose between having you come on for Song of Solomon or Eve's Bayou, and ultimately I chose this one. But
it's okay. It's okay.
I should just ask you for a double header. We should just
you should just come back on.
I could talk about Milkman all day.
Thank you. Okay, and Pilot, like I've modeled my life on Pilot Dead, but
and then of course she references Greeks in there, so I'm with you.
Yes.
Well, someone is going to come on and talk to us about Song of Solomon next week. And I may or may not have read the book. I might just piece out of that episode and just have you and Jay and Ty have that conversation. Anyways,
I'm ready.
We will see what happens.
You're talking about reading a book by a woman when she was asked in an interview, when people said to her, the interviewer said, people say your work is difficult. It's hard to get through. And she calmly responds, well, if my work is difficult for you, then it's not for you. And next question.
Come on.
Not even.
Come on, Miss Morrison.
What a perfect answer.
Yeah.
I was there.
All right. Our show is engineered by Rob Parra. Carrie Stimson provides technical support. Artwork by Jamie Varon. And our intro music is by Phil Circus. Bye, everyone.
Bye.